The New York City Rent Board bankrupts landlords while their buildings are falling apart. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's coming out of New York City. Now, as I've said before, New York is one of those places where they absolutely hate landlords there, okay? And I'm not exactly sure why any person, individual in their right mind would want to invest there, but a lot of people do. And I'm sure a lot of people have made great money there. But the problem I have is they have all of these rules, all these regulations, and in particular, the thing that I hate the most is the rent control policy they have up there, okay? So in New York, the only rent increases that you're allowed to give the tenant are the ones that the rent board approves for those rent controlled units, okay? So a landlord can't say, hey, my costs have increased for the last year exponentially, so I need to increase my rents by 5%. If the rent board says, well, no, you can only raise your rent by 1%, okay? So you have this unelected group of people who up there are making decisions that have to do with your business and your finances, and you just have to take it. That's why, man, I couldn't deal with it. I wouldn't be able to handle all of that, okay? Especially considering that, you could easily lose everything if you aren't allowed to increase your rents enough to cover your expenses, okay? So, yeah, the rent board up in New York, what they did was they passed one of the larger increases that they've allowed in the last few years, right? And people are upset. They're mad. The tenants are piping mad because guess what? The landlords actually need to be able to raise their rent so they can cover expenses because, hey, we have to deal with inflation too. They think that, hey, the tenants are the only ones who have to deal with inflation. No, okay? Like I've said many times before, insurance costs increase. Property tax costs increase. The cost of paying staff increases, if you have property management. The cost of maintenance increases. The cost of parts and labor increases for repairs, okay? The cost of everything has gone up, yet they seem to think that, hey, landlords don't deserve a rent increase. Well, you know what's going to happen if they don't get a rent increase that's enough for them to cover the expenses? Well, the buildings will fall into disrepair. They'll just be falling apart, okay? And that's exactly what's happening in a lot of places in New York right now. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Okay, what do you think of a government organization being the only ones who can set how much you can increase your rents by? I mean, do you see the problems that this kind of situation can create? A rent board, okay? And they're accountable to no one. And the people appointed to the board, some of them, they are representatives for landlords, right? But some of them have absolutely no clue about running a business, finances, etc. And the only thing they care about is, oh, well, we got to keep the tenants in cheap rent because they can't afford anymore, regardless of the fact that, hey, the landlords are literally going bankrupt. Anyway, this article is coming from the New York Post, and it says, Thursday's rent hikes aren't nearly enough to save New York City landlords or housing stock. And this is an opinion article, okay? And it is by someone who is pro-landlord. And this is the kind of article that, this stuff needs to be said, okay? It needs to be said because there aren't enough people out there getting our stories out, saying, hey, why do they need these sort of rent increases? Why are the rents going up so high in places that aren't covered by rent control? Well, because of inflation, because of the price of everything else going up. But anyway, let's get into this article and see what it says. Tenant advocates are already squealing after Thursday's preliminary decision by the city's Rent Stabilization Guidelines Board to okay modest rent hikes for the city's 965,000 rent-regulated units. The de Blasio years had fed activists the habit-forming drug of $0 increases, and tenant groups continue to demand them. But the preliminary authorization by the 9-member board of rent hikes of between 2 and 4% for 1-year leases and 4 to 6% for 2-year leases, a final figure is expected by next month, is still less than it should be when compared to inflation and a slew of rising costs. Yeah, Okay, so from what I just read, okay, if you're renewing a tenant for a 1 year lease, you can increase the rents from 2 to 4%. So if let's just use $1,000 as an example, okay? Your rent is $1,000 for you to stay in this unit, whatever unit you have, right? What is a 2% rent increase on $1,000, right? Well, a 1% increase is $10. A 2% would be $20. Okay, so they are squealing, they are upset because landlords will be able to rise rent on $1,000 by $20. That is ridiculous, okay? That is not that much money. And if the landlords really do need these rent increases due to inflation, then they should allow it. But I mean, they're going to fight tooth and nail to try to make sure the landlords get nothing. That's what they've been doing. They've been holding the rents down way, way below what they should be, even to the point where landlords are just losing tons of money and they don't care. Okay, they don't care. And they never will. They don't understand that, hey, not all landlords are rich, okay? And not all of these rent-controlled units in the city of New York are owned by mega corporations. There are a lot of small mom-and-pop landlords who own rent-controlled units in the city. And maybe they're squeezing by, but they're not going to be able to squeeze by forever on this, okay? They're not. It's just not possible. Anyway, let's keep going. At best, such hikes are but a down payment on protecting the city from the disinvestment and decay that threaten our regulated housing stock. Indeed, the fact that increases in this range amid 8% inflation are even controversial reminds us of how unusual rent regulation is and how it distorts New York's housing market. Yeah, that is a great point right there, okay? The inflation rate, it's actually higher than 8%. I read that last month it was 8.5%, okay? Insane, okay? And the fact that anyone is complaining about a rent increase for 1 year leases of 2 to 4% and for 2 year leases of 4 to 6%, that just shows you that these people, they don't live in reality, okay? They seem to think that landlords are impervious to inflation. Meanwhile, only our expenses shouldn't have to go up at all. But they, like, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? You're out of your minds, okay? And, like this guy said, it says that the rent regulation, it is so unusual and it distorts the housing market so much. The funny thing is that, the rent regulated units in New York City only represent 1 out of every 3 housing units in the city. So that means that 2/3 of the housing stock there is, just unregulated. That is a good thing. But what that does also is, because there are so many, units that are rent regulated, that drives up the prices on the other units. So that's why people say, hey, New York is one of the most expensive places to live in the entire country. If you don't get lucky and somehow get in that small minority of units that is rent regulated, well, you're screwed. You're going to end up paying some of the highest rents in the entire country. Anyway, after all, landlords are not exempt from rising costs. Per federal data, the cost of heating oil rose 70% from September to March, natural gas 21.6%, electricity 11.1%. The city's water board has approved a 5% hike, and post-COVID property tax assessments are likely to spike as well come July. Small contractors, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, whom landlords hire for repairs, will be raising their fees too. Yeah, absolutely. As you can tell, all of the cost of utilities have increased. They just went over that right there, okay? But, it's not something that the rent board or the tenants even think about. Hey, somebody's got to pay for these utilities. That's why, in my opinion, that's why I like to say, I'm not sure if this is possible in New York, but make the tenants pay their own utilities, okay? And I know that's not possible in some of these big buildings where they share a single boiler and, share a HVAC system. But, if possible, make them pay their own bills, okay? Because then suddenly they will care about, the utility costs. Arbitrarily capping increases for one sector of the economy will have side effects. Absent a sufficient rent hike, owners might have to choose between, say, utilities and roof repairs and hope for a dry summer. That's especially true for the mom and pops, many of them immigrants who account for as much as half of all rent stabilized building owners. Yeah, there's another good fact right there, okay? Half of all the rent stabilized building owners are small mom and pop landlords. So don't believe the lies they tell you that it's these giant mega corporations, okay? Small mom and pop landlords have to deal with the exact same thing. So every time you put a policy or a rule in place thinking you're going to hit the rich guy, guess what? The rich guy, they have, plenty of money. They have plenty of emergency reserves. They're willing to deal with smaller profits, right? But the small guy, they won't have any profits. They will be bankrupt, okay? And then guess what? They're going to sell their building to that rich guy. So the point is that when landlords are starved, tenants may also suffer. The modest increase on the table will be little more than life support, not the higher hike or full deregulation New York housing really needs. Not when the net income of landlords has declined 7.8% over the past year by the board's own figures, only the fourth such decrease in the last 30 years. And, that is ridiculous, okay? So income for these rent-regulated units has decreased by nearly 8% in the last year. That is how bad it has gotten. And, this small, tiny rent increase isn't going to even cover the rising costs that are affecting pretty much everyone. So, I can't tell you how much I am annoyed with all the tenants and the advocates saying that, hey, greedy landlords, they're the ones, causing all the problems. No. Our economy is messed up right now because they printed too much money up in DC. That is the real truth, okay? Then you throw in stuff like a war over there in Ukraine, and guess what? The cost of everything is increasing. And so landlords, they need to increase their costs. They need to be able to increase their costs, and they can't. They're stuck under ridiculous rent control policies, okay? And they got this ridiculous rent board making the decisions instead of the landlords themselves being allowed to make the decisions. So like I said, I wouldn't invest in New York, especially if I was a small mom and pop landlord, okay? There's plenty of places outside of there where you can invest. I invest long distance, okay? I use property management for my properties down in Kansas City, and I make a good profit on them. I don't have to deal with none of this garbage, okay? And I suggest that other landlords, they do the same.